Thank you very much for having me. I am very grateful to be here. Does this sound okay? Sorry, okay, perfect. So I am here today speaking to you as a prosecutor and also as a mother. And I want to share with you my experience on prosecuting cases involving child exploitation. For more than 10 years, I prosecuted a majority of my cases involving protection of children, so child exploitation online. This perspective shapes what I'm going to talk about to you today. But similar to the ambassador, I am also a mother of 2 children, of tweens and teens, a 12-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy. And the internet is absolutely terrifying to me from that perspective, especially given what I've seen in all of my years of prosecution of these cases. So let's talk about what the threats are out there and how my perspective shapes that. First, as a prosecutor, these cases are very difficult to prosecute. You heard about the Welcome to Video case, how these cases are incredibly challenging because they cross borders repeatedly. We have criminals in multiple countries who are exploiting children in other countries. The technology constantly keeps changing, and although investigators are training in new techniques every day, they cannot keep up with the criminal desire to exploit children on the internet. So we have to constantly educate ourselves and make ourselves aware of what the threats are. From a parent's perspective, we live in a very different world than the one I grew up in. Although I don't consider myself that old, I grew up with no computers, no phones. I went outside to play all day. And what my mom worried about is that there was usually some man on the corner that might kidnap me or someone in the park that might prey upon me. I don't worry about that threat so much anymore. What I worry about is my children online. When they are on their phones or their iPads, I worry about who they're communicating with and who might prey upon them. Because for me, I have seen so many different creative and horrible ways that people have preyed upon children. I have seen people use video game Xboxes, PlayStations to find children. I've seen people use Snapchat, different programs that kids communicate on to find children. And so my children now roll their eyes at me when I constantly ask them, do you know who you're communicating with? Have you met that person in person? Is it one of your friends at school? I've been saying this to them since they were probably 5 years old, and they understand that there are bad people on the internet that they need to be afraid of. But sometimes even those warnings aren't enough, because people who want to commit these crimes are very determined to find ways to get to children through the internet. So I want to talk about today what the threats are that we're seeing at the Department of Justice through prosecuting these crimes, and then what we can do collectively from all of our different perspectives to be able to combat these crimes. So first, let's talk about what are the various different threats that we're seeing today, and they continue to evolve. Behind all of the threats, no matter which ones we're talking about, is the internet. It is both an incredibly wonderful thing in that it allows us to make this world much smaller and be able to communicate with each other, and it is an incredibly dangerous thing in that it is unchecked in so many ways. And we have to understand it, and we have to be able to have the right regulations in place to protect those that are using this very powerful and very good, in many ways, tool. So I want to talk about the threats that we're seeing in the cases that have been prosecuted over the last few years. The current threats that are most prevalent And while these are based on US cases, these are also the cases that are happening here in Croatia and happening around the world. So I'm just giving you my perspective on them. We have seen a tremendous rise in sextortion and cyberbullying cases where children are being exploited and asked to send images, and I'll talk more about each of these. We're seeing a lot of enticement and abduction cases. The dark web is still a very prominent feature in these types of cases. I'm also going to talk about live streaming or live audience cases. When we had the COVID pandemic, we all started using platforms like Zoom and WebEx. Well, so did the criminals, and we'll talk about that. And crowdsourcing, where people work together to exploit children. We'll talk about virtual sex trafficking, international sex tourism, and then the newest cases we're seeing, AI-generated images. So let's talk about each of those briefly. At the beginning of sextortion, many of you may be aware, I try to pretend and hope this isn't happening with my children, but children are very often now engaged in sexual conversations over texts and messaging apps. The statistics vary very widely as to how many children in middle schools and high schools are engaging in this kind of chat. It involves both boys and girls, and there's very wide distribution. When a child sends an image to another child at their school, it takes seconds to send that to the entire school or a much broader universe of people. And they can't get these images back. And these are conversations that we need to have with our children, as uncomfortable as they are, because if we don't talk to them about it and they send one of those images, it can be incredibly devastating for them, even if they're not exploited further. Just being teenagers and dealing with this is incredibly difficult. Can lead to children being humiliated at school, to being bullied, to being blackmailed into sending more images. It can lead to school discipline if school leadership finds out, and even police involvement for a child that sends an image. So having these conversations and letting your children know that there are incredible consequences to sending images or sending messages back and forth is incredibly important, because it also makes them vulnerable to being sextorted, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Sextortion is when an offender gets an image of a child or an adult, but in this case, we're talking about children, and then tells them, you need to send me more images, or I am going to send it to your friends or your family or other people. And if you say this to a teenage girl who is incredibly worried about her reputation in middle school and worried that her friends or her parents might find out that she made a stupid mistake and sent a picture, and in her mind it's the end of the world, it often leads to sending more images. And it's not just girls, this happens with boys too. I've had cases involving both. And I want to talk about a famous case. This isn't one I worked on, but it's one that is very well known in the US. Incredibly devastating consequences of what can happen in a sextortion case. This young woman named Amanda Todd, when she was in middle school, she was a Canadian. She sent a picture to a Dutch man named Aiden Coben, who also exploited a dozen American children as well. Amanda, after sending this one picture, was harassed for years online, and she kept being asked to send pictures. She was bullied at school, she felt like the world had ended, and ultimately she posted a video on YouTube where she used these cards and told her story about who she was, what had happened to her, how she felt like her life was over and she couldn't handle this kind of pressure anymore. And at 15 years old, Amanda Todd took her own life. And sadly, this isn't the only victim of sextortion who has committed suicide. I also prosecuted a case of sextortion that haunts me still to this day, of a young man who pretended to be a teenage girl and started reaching out to girls in his high school. He was actually only 18 years old, and he would send them messages and friend them and get them to trust him, thinking he was another girl. He also preyed on vulnerable girls online that he found around the world. He would look for girls that were cutters, that were speaking about having emotional issues, and he would target specifically those girls and then start getting them to send him pictures of themselves. And once they sent pictures, he would tell them, I'm going to tell your friends and I'm going to tell your family if you don't send me more. And so these girls, many of them, dozens of them, sent him more pictures. And ultimately, one of those victims ended up committing suicide as well because she couldn't handle the pressure of feeling humiliated and ashamed that she had sent these pictures. Luckily, that individual is spending 30 years in prison in the United States for being prosecuted in 2 different jurisdictions, both in Maryland, where I prosecuted him, and in another jurisdiction where the victim who committed suicide was. So there is justice, and there's plenty of work for us to do, but there's serious consequences of these cases. Another threat that we see a lot is enticement and abduction, where an individual befriends a child online, builds trust with them, makes them think that they love them, that they think they're the most beautiful, wonderful thing, and then lures them to a location to meet in person, and ultimately grooms them, and they meet up, and then that individual sexually abuses the child. I've prosecuted these kinds of cases as well, and we've had a number of cases in the United States where a predator is in one jurisdiction or one state, goes to a child in another state, and then takes them away and abuses them. These are just 2 examples in the United States that are recent cases. One in California where a child was abducted and sexually abused, and another in New Mexico. Both of these cases involve an adult male finding a child several hundred miles away and befriending that child and encouraging them to meet up ultimately, and then taking them away and abusing them. At least for us, we have one set of federal laws to prosecute these cases, but these kinds of cases are happening here too, and for you, it's so close to just get to another country. And then you have a whole nother dynamic of dealing with different countries' laws in order to find these people, and that cooperation between countries is so critical to protecting children in these types of cases. You already heard the ambassador talk about the dark web. This is just a press release from that Welcome to Video case, where this was an incredible example of international cooperation. Multiple countries around the globe worked together. We were able to rescue 23 children from the US, UK, and Spain, and over 300 people around the world were arrested as a result of the global cooperation that happened in this case. So, as you heard, a tenacious investigator helped crack this case. We can, working together, take down these types of networks, and it's incredibly important for us to continue to collaborate to do so. As I mentioned, we've also seen a rise in live streaming, where offenders meet in live groups to participate in the abuse of a child. This is a horrific use of those online platforms that we all depend on for meetings around the world, where a child is abused live by somebody and other people are joining that office meeting platform to be able to watch the abuse or to demand certain types of abuse. I had a similar case over Skype before Zoom was popular, where a father was abusing his child and would have individuals watch it live or make requests of what kinds of abuse they wanted. And the way that we found out about the case was because an individual who was in New Zealand or Australia, one of the two, was actually, it crossed the line of what he was willing to tolerate, and he reported to the police that he was getting these issues. And then we found an individual in Maryland who was also communicating with this father. And as a result of those two individuals being arrested and cooperating with the police, we were able to identify the location of the child in Kansas, go rescue that child from her home, and her father is now serving a sentence of 260 years in prison. So there is ways working together that we can find these people and be able to prosecute them. Another phenomenon we're seeing is crowdsourcing, where you have groups of offenders in an organized criminal network working together to be able to find victims. You might have one enticing a victim, another luring them to a location, another sending out images to people soliciting them, sort of all working together in a network to identify victims, abuse them, and record that abuse. And then we see virtual sex trafficking, where in this case that I have an example here, the defendant used messenger and webcam applications to seek women in the Philippines to sexually abuse or offer their children for sexual abuse. And then he would pay money for those videos or live transmissions. This is a pretty common phenomenon that we're seeing, that we're prosecuting, where American and European individuals will solicit the abuse of children in countries that are incredibly poor or have low income, where getting $5 or $10 or $15 for that abuse can be critical money for that family, and they're desperate, and these individuals take advantage of that type of abuse. Luckily, there's significant consequences, as you can see here. This was a 160-year sentence. I recognize nobody can actually serve that sentence, but it's the message that it sends that we care that much about protecting children. I had a case, the most significant case I think I prosecuted involved an individual who abused children between the ages of 2 and 4 and recorded it, and it was the most horrific thing I'd ever seen, and it was around the time when my daughter was 4, turning 5. And I asked for 560 years for a sentence. He only got 420, but I know that he is never getting out of prison, so I'm okay with that. Another phenomenon we see quite often is international sex tourism, where individuals are traveling to other destinations in order to abuse children. There are message boards out there today, you can find them, where people are looking for places where they can travel to have sex with underage individuals. We had, as I'll show you next, a case where an individual traveled to Prague to find underage boys. We have people traveling to Southeast Asia. It's all over the world where there are children who are being trafficked for the purpose of serving people who are coming from other countries wanting to have sex with them. And as I said, this is an example, a recent one, just in August, where an individual, a US individual, pled guilty to traveling to Prague to have commercial sex with children. This individual is actually 80 years old, who was prosecuted. He took 14 trips to Prague between 2011 and 2021 to engage in commercial sex with minor boys. So there is a lot of work, like I said, to be done, and a lot of ways that children are being exploited through use of the internet. And then I think one of the most concerning for me, they're all concerning, but one that is a new phenomenon that we are seeing more and more often is the use of AI to create child sexual abuse material. So we have seen just in the last 6 months a couple of different case examples of arrests or prosecutions or starts of prosecutions for AI-generated child sexual abuse material. In the first instance, it was generating child exploitation material from real images of children that were morphed using AI into child sexual abuse material. And in the second instance, it was actually using an AI tool to create child sexual abuse material. So telling the tool what images you wanted it to create. Now, we have laws in the United States that don't require it to be an actual child. It can be these generated images, and that is still a crime. And if you're not there yet, I would encourage looking at that as a development area in the law, because, as I said, there are plenty of examples of using those real images of children and making them sexually exploitive. And that can be just as devastating to a child as those sextortion images, as those other images that end up out there in the world. It is terrifying when you think about posting innocent images of your children online, on Facebook or Instagram or different things, sharing a pleasant family vacation experience, only for it to be turned into something like this. So this is another area where we are very much trying to use our legal tools to go after new and creative ways that criminals are trying to exploit children. Now, overall, with all of these threats that are out there, it can be daunting and devastating to have this kind of overwhelming amount of criminal activity that is targeting children. But there's a lot that we can do collectively coming from our different spheres. As governments in multiple countries around the world, we can ensure that we are joining the conventions that allow us to share evidence more quickly, like the Budapest Convention and the second additional protocol that the ambassador mentioned. We can also make sure there are laws in place, like having the Amber Alert system, so we can quickly identify when children are missing and find them. We can make sure that our laws criminalize the type of conduct that we're seeing. As law enforcement, quick information sharing is absolutely critical. Countries working together with their neighbors, with people around the world, because as the examples that I've given you show you, there are so many cases that cross country borders. And so we have to work together to be able to quickly pass that information, to build these investigations, to find people who are targeting children. Non-governmental organizations, for us, are a critical piece of this in the United States. We work very closely with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which you'll hear more from later today. They are a key partner in finding what's out there, getting the leads to law enforcement, helping us develop these cases. And then we are constantly trying to work with private industry, especially with internet service providers, like the platforms where children are communicating, to make sure that they are passing information on when they see any kind of exploitive material, so that we can quickly develop investigations and follow up on those leads. It's also incredibly important for academics to continue to research the areas of what tools are people using, what is the latest technology, how can we understand better the internet and understand how it's being used to commit these crimes. And then in so many of these cases, for me, I had to sometimes put a child on the stand. I tried to avoid that if I could. And in both the child exploitation cases I did and the human trafficking cases I did that involved teenagers. And having a victim advocate who was somebody who could work closely with that child and not be the prosecutor or the police or somebody that can be very intimidating was absolutely critical in bringing these people to justice. So thank you to all of you who advocate for victims every day and work with them. And then we, as parents, for any of you who have children, have such an important role every day to be vigilant about knowing what our children are doing on the internet, who are they communicating with, telling them about what the risks are and what the dangers are, just like we do when you say, look both ways before you cross the street, or before they drive a car, you go through all kinds of effort to make sure they understand how to safely drive. It's just as important that we collectively make sure that our children understand what is going on the internet and how they can protect themselves and how we are there to help protect them as well. So I hope that collectively, together, we will continue this fight. This is such an important topic. It is something I am incredibly passionate about. I, in my small role, am very grateful that I was able to bring justice to families of victims for those that I prosecuted, but it feels like such a very small number of the overall big picture of the threat out there. And I would just encourage you all to continue to advocate for children, continue to protect the internet for them, and together, I think we can do great things to be able to support them. And thank you very much for having me here.